Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Kelsey Waldron and I am an incoming co-president of BU Disability Law and Advocates and Allies. We'd like to welcome everyone both joining us in this room as well as on our Zoom link. I'll turn it over to Riley just to introduce herself.
Yeah, my name is Riley. I will be the secretary next year for the BU Disability Law Organization. So I'm happy to be here.
BUD-Law is a student organization dedicated to creating space for advocates and allies interested in disability law and committed to creating more accessible, inclusive spaces in our community at BU Law. We are excited to introduce the Pike Lecturer today. This is the 17th annual Pike Lecture, bringing together scholars and advocates committed to health and disability law. The Pike Lecture is named for BU alumnus Neil Pike, who earned his JD here in 1937. As a child, Neil Pike contracted an illness that left him blind. He attended the Perkins School for the Blind before entering BU Law. Neil Pike was the first blind person admitted to the bar of the United States Supreme Court. He practiced law for 45 years and was an avid supporter of BU Law and tireless advocate for individuals with disabilities. Today's Pike Lecture is about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Global South. I'll now turn it over to Riley to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Just move closer to the mic. All right, so our speaker, Michael Stein, is a leading expert on disability law and policy, especially in the international context. Professor Stein is the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, and he has taught at Harvard since 2005. He was also personally involved in the development of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He's published numerous books and articles with major journals and academic publishers, and has received awards from institutions such as the American Bar Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was also appointed to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council by President Obama. Those are just some brief highlights from Professor Stein's extremely active and impactful career. We're very lucky to have him in the Law Tower today. Thank you. And we also wanted to give you this gift from the law school.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wow, gifts too. Thank you. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure being here. It's my first visit back since the P event, and I have many, many years of happy memories of interacting with BU and with some of the faculty for decades. Some of my former students have taught here in your disability law course, some of my mentees, and so it's really a great pleasure to be here and to honor Mr. Pike's memory and to hopefully share some good ideas with you. Today we're looking at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, something that has obsessed me, taken my time for the last 20 or so years. I was fortunate enough to have been involved in its negotiation under the auspices of the gentleman sitting at the front of the room, Ambassador Luis Gallegos of Ecuador. And since then, 18 years of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. I've worked on the ground in 44 countries, many others virtually, and I have, thankfully, a beautiful train of PhD students, mentees, and others who are continuing this work elsewhere. And so it's something that I'm very proud of, that I'm very happy about. It's something that has obsessed my life and taken me away from legal history and from musty old books that don't extract psychic cost, at least in that sense. And we're very proud of it because it's engendered the largest law reform in the world. It's engendered the largest transformation of UN programming. It has changed the way all international development is done, whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals, now including disability, whether it's the World Bank committing to being disability inclusive by 2030, and they loan out or give out close to $200 billion a year. And it has changed the lives of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, DPOs, disabled persons organizations, or if you're younger and cooler than I am, OPDs, but I'm going to stick to DPOs. around the world and enabling them to claim their rights. And so it's something that obsesses me, presents me, spends all my time, and yet, as someone who is introspective and someone who works in the world and engages with civil society, I've had this growing notion over the last 20 or so years that perhaps what we created in New York, perhaps what has been refined and presented via Geneva, perhaps what has occupied lots and lots of academic time. Speaking for myself, I'm well over 200 articles, book chapters, and such, just simply on disability law and policy. I often wonder, did we leave people out? And the answer is yes. And could we do better? And I believe the answer is yes. And putting it in larger human rights terms, my question to myself is, have we been culturally, legally, resource-wise sensitive enough to the groups that we were intending to help? And were those of us who were privileged to have been at the UN sensitive enough to this? So it's not a dialogue on the universality of human rights per se, but it's rather when you create a large framework that's up here and you expect and allow and encourage states to transpose, to bring it down to their national levels, have we done so in such a way that is going to enable them to do that, or have we strayed towards the area of colonialism maybe, or imperialism, or at the very least insensitivity? And that's something that has kind of been occupying my thoughts. My co-author on this piece, which is in the New Haven Journal people, and the book that's following, Paul Harper, is with us on Zoom in Australia. Paul, a shout out to you since it's 3 a.m. in the morning, and it's very kind of you to be awake. And we've been thinking about that. Having said that, there's the irony that Paul and I are extraordinarily privileged relative to the groups that we're speaking about. We're both white males. We're both in highly developed countries. We're both well-educated and relatively well-paid and taken care of. And so there's a kind of irony that's going on there as well, which we kind of wrestle with ourselves by saying, well, sometimes you need those from outside the group to raise questions about members of the group, but I'm very aware of questions, whether it's in the philosophical domain of representation or whether it's in the area of authenticity or whether it's even wokeness, about what it is that we're thinking about and what it is that we're trying to go for. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the CRPD is, just to set the framework, how it came about, and how, in our view, it was very much a global south endeavor. And when we use the terms global south and global north, we're using heuristics that are not complete. Here in the global north, we have Indian reservations, we have African American communities an hour outside of Richmond and Oxford, Mississippi. We have white poor communities in Appalachia, none of whom have adequate water, electricity, power, etc. So it's not a strictly geographical divide, but it is a useful heuristic. And so when we think about it, what's been going on? So let's begin with where the disability world was in the year 2001, when there was a movement at the General Assembly to please consider whether there should be a disability-specific human rights treaty. And at that point, if we were to do a time slice and look at what the world was like, we said that 10% of the world were individuals with disabilities, 650 million. At that point, now with revised World Bank and World Health Organization data, we say more like 15% and roughly 1.3 billion, but at that point we said 10% of the world. And yet 20% of the world who are living in poverty, below the $1 a day, correlated to particular circumstances, were those with disabilities. We looked at the world and looked at first the UN world through a study by Professor Gerard Quinn, my classmate at Harvard and my good friend, and now the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability, and by Teresia Degner, another old friend who eventually became chair of the CRPD committee. And it looked through all the UN system and basically showed that the existing treaties that were there and the treaty bodies who were receiving complaints, right, were not including disability. Of all those human rights treaties, only the Convention on the Rights of the Child mentioned disability once in the preamble as a group that ought not to be discriminated against, and once in Article 23 as in children with disabilities, to the extent possible, should not be excluded and should be allowed to go to school, which in 2022 we look back on and kind of cringe a bit. But in 1989 when it was drafted, in 1990 when it was adopted, that was considered rather forward-looking. And in fact, if we're being really, really honest, in much of the world it's still considered rather forward-looking. But disability wasn't there in terms of text. It wasn't there in terms of complaint systems being brought. There was a study by Leandro Despuey, a special rapporteur, who looked at 10 years of treaty bodies and found that only 17 complaints mentioned disability, and of those, 13 were inadmissible based on procedural grounds. So the UN wasn't functioning that way. The UN wasn't functioning as far as the Millennium Development Goals from 2000 and 2015, because of those 8 development goals, not one had the word disability in it. And although the idea was to have world poverty, we said 20% of those living in poverty had disabilities. The word disability didn't appear. It was intended to increase the number of children of K to 12 age who were in school, and at that time there were 70 million children who were not in school of that age. 1/3 were kids with disabilities, but the D word didn't appear. If this sounds like modern day DEI and corporate social responsibility and business and human rights, I hope you're grabbing onto that, because part of the argument about disability rights is pretty much goes back to that wonderful piece of philosophy called Not the Hippopotamus. Does this ring a bell for any parents? It's about everybody, but not the hippopotamus. But not the hippopotamus. So why is disability being excluded? Also, circa the year 2001, we looked around the world, and the number of places segregated, isolated, where a person with disabilities were placed in institutions, segregated schools, and so forth, were tremendous. Less so in the developing world because they could not afford those places, with the exception of post-Soviet, where they're quite popular. And so people with disabilities, programming around the world, excluded, not included in MDG's work, not included in human rights treaties. And the government of Mexico led an endeavor at the General Assembly to say, hey, what about a disability-specific treaty? We've already done, so to speak, women, children, immigrants, race, etc. What about disability? And this effort was led by the Global South, not by the Global North. And remember, some of the rhetoric about human rights is that it's very much led by the Global North in its extreme, arising from colonialists and other ideas. But the idea that it's we of the great Global North who bequeath the Global South and do all these good things for you. But here was the government of Mexico, along with a coalition of other states from the Global South, leading the way for disability. And if we pause for a minute, because I also teach law and policy, and ask what the law and policy is, why Mexico? Because Mexico had come under severe criticism, and still does, for operating psychiatric institutions that have had the light shone on them in naming and shaming reports and have not dramatically changed those institutions. We here in the US see the flip side of those if you were to actually read through the immigration asylum cases that are coming up through the BIJs and into the Ninth Circuit and elsewhere, which is people seeking asylum because they're going to be sent back to Mexico specifically, and being subjected to conditions of isolation, electroshock therapy, strapping down, that UN special rapporteurs and others have referred to as conditions of torture. By the way, it's not them and there and then, it's also we here and us. Just cast your eyes this way towards the Judge Rottenberg institution, not very far away, which has come under criticism, justly so, for attaching electroshocks to children with autism and using that to amend their behavior. So not always there and then, also here and now. So why Mexico? Why was Mexico doing it? And the answer is politics. For Mexico, Vicente Fox was running for office. A person against whom he was running was a person with a disability, and as part of the deal to stand out of the way or roll out of the way and allow Fox to take the party's nomination, he agreed to take the disability treaty forward to the General Assembly. And if you track from when the General Assembly is engaged on this to when the General Assembly adopts by consensus, December 13th, 2006, somebody's birthday, 5 years, that is the government of Vicente Fox. And so the developing world, the global south, is here pushing for a disability rights treaty. And the General Assembly said, well, you know, we're kind of treated out. We've done, you know, women and children and race, and we've solved all those sorts of things. We're not going to authorize you to go and negotiate one, but we'll authorize an ad hoc session, right? 8 sessions of 2 weeks each in New York City, where you can determine whether or not there should be a disability treaty. And the UN works by regions and cycles that way. And it was the time for Latin America and the Caribbean, and time came for Ecuador to be asked, would you please chair these negotiations? And the ambassador, sitting right here, so he'll correct me, was asked whether he could do that. And at that time, you were also with the Latin Caribbean group and with the Operational Protocol on Torture and many other endeavors with a very small mission. But he did what all smart people do. They go home and ask their spouses, their partners, right? And was told, who doesn't like disabled people, right? This will be easy. Who doesn't like disabled people? Well, I could fill in that blank. But in any case, the ambassador graciously took it over, and we went to New York. So let's stop for a minute and just consider, right, what happens to negotiations in New York. Who is it who can attend? Well, the states are there through their missions to the United Nations. Some are larger, if they're wealthier nations. Some are smaller. You need to staff people to live in New York City year-round. It's rather expensive for everyone. But what about the civil society? What about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, DPOs, disabled people's organizations? Who can afford to be in New York? Well, the answer very quickly and clearly becomes those who are from the global north, those who have very, very good friends but aren't from the global north. And basically, it's the wealthy, the elite, the Western, take your pick, who can do it. Speaking, you know, for myself, you know, obviously I'm enormously privileged relative to those groups, and I was able to attend pretty much by sleeping on my friends Richard and Susan's sofa on 18th Street. There's a sofa that's got a little plaque on the bottom of it that says, you know, Stein slept here. It's the only time it's ever going to have a plaque like that. So who can attend? Who can attend New York? And so immediately we see there's a power imbalance. And we see that there is access fees. And there is gatekeeping based upon resources and access. But then there's also the way that UN treaties were negotiated at the time. And until this convention, it was always about the states sitting there in this large chamber room, in this case, conference room number 4. And civil society sometimes gaining some access, right, in terms of through a procedure, ECOSOC, being able to attend, but not being able to intervene, not being able to receive documents, not being able to submit documents, not being able to speak from the floor of the conference room, not to be able to negotiate formally and informally outside the chambers. And that was changed by the Global South through Ambassador Gallegos, who came from a country that not only was aware of human rights, but at that point had a vice president who was a wheelchair user, later a president who was a wheelchair user, and in between those two times he was also the UN Special Envoy on Disability, and because he's a very wise man and aware of inclusion. And he said, if the mandate is to consider whether there should be a disability treaty, how on earth can we do that without having the voices of people with disabilities involved? And so enabling the DPOs to attend through that procedural device, creating the system whereby at the end of every session, the UN runs from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6, people with disabilities through something called an International Disability Caucus were able to present evidence, do interventions from the floor of the UN, changed the way that UN negotiations occurred from then through the present. We're seeing it now in terms of some of the elaboration of a treaty for elders, which, by the way, the ambassador is now in charge of. So you've got the two big groups. You've got the two big groups, God bless you. And that also changed the expectations about people with disabilities. And if you stop for a minute, consider that the aphorism of the International Disability Rights Movement is nothing about us without us. Don't make decisions that affect our lives without having us there, present, and involved meaningfully in making those decisions. This is what brought it to life. Much of the pushback by international and national disability groups against paternalism reflects that idea of something about us without us, which if you perhaps cast your minds back to when you were 6 years old and taken to the doctor by a parent or guardian, and the doctor asked, what's wrong with her? Not ask you, but ask your person what's wrong with her. Or that cringe-worthy date that you've tried to erase from your mind where the server asked the person you were with, well, what does he want? Right? Nothing about us without us. Being able to be involved in these decisions. And what the ambassador did changed the form of it. We see it in the text of the treaty, which you're very welcome to go to the UN DESA site and review it in numerous languages and easy read as well. But we would cite to Article 3, the general principles about being involved. We would cite to Article 4.3, in which states not only have to actively consult with DPOs and civil society, but also enable them financially to be involved. So think about that. That's actually like funding the opposite party or funding the semi-opposition party. And it's not unprecedented, either in politics generally or in disability politics. Here in Massachusetts, right, the Disability Commission funds Massachusetts advocates standing strong to bring their different perspectives across the border in New York. The Office of Persons with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities has funded SANIs, the Self-Advocates of New York State. They have offices in Albany. They have offices in Manhattan. They are there and funded with support to go and disagree with the government on things like policy, provision of Medicare, Medicaid support, and so on. Going back to the treaty, Article 33, as far as the monitoring provisions of conventions, civil society is meant to be a part. It's meant to be a part in that they are entitled to show up in Geneva during the periodic meetings when the CRPD committee sits and receives states' reports. They're entitled to receive all documents, such as a list of issues. They're entitled to submit shadow reports, alternative communications, ways in which to criticize and or engage with their government. Civil society is also entitled to be present as far as disability civil society in the group that monitors the convention. Because in Article 38 that talks about the committee, it is intended to be representative geographically and otherwise. And there were some interesting things you could ask in Q&A if you like about whether there would be a quota or a minimum amount or a chair. All those things were floated at one point. But the final monitoring provisions were those that we drafted actually across the river during a session between the 5th and the 6th ad hoc sessions, and it's representative. Having said that, to date, every single member of the CRPD committee, except for 2 during the last election, has been a person with a disability. Does that mean that they're knowledgeable disability rights advocates? No. Right? Some of them are put there by their governments because they're hand in glove and are involved with service provision. But by and large, they are disability rights advocates, and the 2 who are not themselves people with disabilities are parents of persons with disabilities, and that raises wonderful and interesting issues of, again, representation, authenticity, and so on, although they're fabulous people, so less so in their particular context. And what we saw early in these ad hoc sessions, without going into the text and into the content of the CRPD, although I encourage you to read it lovingly, choose provisions you might like to tattoo or put on your wall or whatever you might like to do, is that in the early days, DPOs from the developing world were present. In fact, they were the majority of the DPOs who were present in the room. And if we were to look at numbers, we would say that in the first ad hoc session, there were 85 total individuals registered. By the 9th one, which was a rubber stamp with the document, there were over 850. So we know each other fairly well. But India was the largest represented country as far as DPOs in the early days, and then they ran out of money. The indigenous groups were present during the first 3 ad hoc sessions, and they too ran out of money. And so things that would represent the developing world tended to evaporate or kind of go poof. And the perceptions and needs and priorities expressed by DPOs, right, from the developed world took more precedence. This wasn't a case of the states ganging up on the disability community. It was, in my opinion, and I'll get hell for it, but that's okay. It had to do with the DPOs driving the wagon and taking our view, our version of the world, and expressing it in what was finally in the text. So what sort of things by this do I mean? What sort of things by this do I mean? Well, 2 very obvious examples that are not considered sexy in human rights terms are WASH, water, clean sanitation, and hygiene. During the negotiations on the CRPD, there were concurrent negotiations otherwise in the UN on clean water and sanitation. And there were treaties that were passed and other measures that were passed on clean water and sanitation, but that bridge did not make it into the CRPD negotiations. We have clean water under Article 28, Standards of Living. The word sanitation does not appear. It has appeared only once in the CRPD's jurisprudence when it was looking at Haiti post-disaster relief and said, oh, by the way, there ought to be clean sanitation here as well. Another area that is very much, about the global north and not about the global south is there is an absence of landmines. Something like 98% of landmines are created in the global north. Something like 98% of landmines are deployed in the global south. No mention of it in the convention. But let me give you another example in greater detail, and that has to do with independent living. So one of the things we have in this CRPD is an expression of disability-based rights because of the way that people with disabilities have been treated. We spoke about large-scale institutions which still exist. You can look at DRI's website or others and see that institutions still exist around the world, as in psychiatric hospitals, as in women in Guatemala being trafficked for drug and alcohol and sex. From the psychiatric institution on one side of the street to the men's prison on the other side of the street. Mexico, in which women and children are trafficked as well. Ukraine, which is now dealing with its own horrors. Brought under the microscope as well for many years of trafficking institutions and so on. And I'm being very light and very gentle as far as what these conditions are. They have been exposed as conditions arising to levels of torture, inhuman, and degrading treatment, as well they should. So when the international disability community looked at independent living, they were thinking overtly and amongst ourselves, because I was at the International Disability Caucus, which was an interesting dynamic too. Imagine any particular identity group that you happen to be in, maybe even your own family, and you can imagine what it was like meeting from 8 to 10 every morning in this chamber where we had to leave with one univocal position for 1.3 billion persons. So lots of screaming, hair pulling, name calling, crying, just like any family dinner, right? But at the end of those 2 hours, there was a position that was passed over to the UN, to the chair, to say, here's what we, the global community, want. And in this case, independent living, the vision that was expressed for it under Article 19 was a deinstitutionalization idea, which is great. I have no objection to it, right? Here in the US, we had our own deinstitutionalization movements, some more successful than others. We might recall the 1980s in New York with the psychiatric institutions opening up, but without supports being given to those individuals when put out onto the street, and they wound up creating the homeless problem. Funny thing that. And they wound up increasing at the same time with the mandatory federal sentencing guidelines the dramatic increase of persons of color, and especially persons of color with mental health conditions in our prison population. U.S. is 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Whether you're left, right, or whatever, that's a problem. However you approach it, that's a problem. So we had that. We had the moderately successful 1980s deinstitutionalization movement of persons with intellectual disabilities, People First, and others, supported largely during the Reagan administration, not on the basis of freedom and rights and living in the community, but on the basis of we're going to shift the costs from the federal government to the state governments, and by the way, it's less expensive to have people living in the community, which is true of developed countries. It's not true, say, in Romania or in Georgia or in other places where people are warehoused. And we had the high watermark of disability rights, the Olmstead Decision. People have the right to receive services at home in their communities, but with, of course, a neoclassical loophole the size that we could drive a battleship through that said unless it's going to adversely affect the same group in their moving towards the communities. That was many years until Sam Bagenstos went to the ADA division of the Department of Justice and implemented Olmstead state by state by state across the South. But we have made great progress here. So here the whole deinstitutionalization movement is affected by these psychiatric survivors and their right, and you know where they're coming from, and you understand their pain and you understand their motivation. But it's about them. And in most of the world, people with disabilities live with their families. And if they're not lucky, maybe they're living on the street. And not all families are good and supportive. Most, I hope or believe, are, but some are not. And it's not about this vision of the independent living movement, which imbues Article 19. And if you want to see what Article 19 is about, perhaps go take a look at Crip Camp on Netflix and my dear great friend Judy Heumann. It's about Berkeley. It's about people with disabilities combining their funds on a monthly basis, pooling their assets, and being able to live independently. In the Berkeley sense, going to school, but then the Ed Roberts Center has spread and put the message out, and it's a Western message. It's a Northern message. It goes from Berkeley across the U.S. It goes to Europe with Adolf Ratzka, who is still alive and well and running the European Network of Independent Living, and is a lovely, lovely guy. It has, in a very small way, gotten to Japan, funded by the Nippon Foundation. But beyond that, where does this independent living idea exist? Well, I could tell you, because I've been there. There are 2 independent living centers in Vietnam. One is run by Madam Hong up in Hanoi. The other is run by Yin Vo down in Saigon. Nobody lives there. They do enormously valuable work. Each one has an accessible van with a wheelchair ramp. And those are pretty much the only 2 in all of Vietnam. And they bring people with disabilities into the center, and they teach them ADL, activities of daily living, things that their parents and families and others who are trying their best can't teach them. How do you keep yourself clean? How do you go to the bathroom? How do you cook for yourself? How do you manage your finances? How do you take care of your body, especially when others, certain cultures, your parents are not going to talk to you about physical or other intimate relationships. That's what they teach them. But is there one in Latin America? Sure, probably, somewhere. What does it look like in Africa, where I was just teaching last week, where I have a chair? Well, in Burundi, there's a home for disabled veterans, and some people from the West went to explore it. They found it was rat infested and didn't have support and had holes in the ceiling and all that. And they wrote a report and said, "This can't be. We got to take them out and put them somewhere else." And these veterans took up arms and said, "No, this is our home. You're not going to take me out." Does that mean that I think it's adequate? No. But can Berkeley exist in Burundi? Maybe, or maybe not. What about, say, what about if you were in Tanzania? How would you get your monthly disability benefit? It's a low-income country. They give out about $15 a month per person. You have to show up in Harare in person in order to claim it. But you don't have to go every month. And so people with disabilities getting on inaccessible buses, spending hours to days to get to the Capitol, to sign in, to get 6 months, 8 months, whatever it is, and then going back. Is that going to support a Berkeley idea of an independent living movement? No. Or maybe you're in South Africa, outside of Cape Town, in Mrs. Fisher's home in Grassy Park. And there's a building which is rented from one of the local Catholic churches. It has 50 individual cells, meaning, for monks and other religious people, not jail cells, right? Individual cells. And the government of South Africa was paying $50 a month on disability benefits. Now, with the rand crashing, it's down to about $25. The staff is no longer paid staff. They simply volunteer because there's inadequate funds to do that. Everyone hands over their monthly benefits. And Mrs. Fisher, who is referred to as Mother or Mother Fisher by the people who live there, spends the money and pools it. And the Lions Club backs up a truck every 2 to 3 weeks with cases and cases of food. That's independent living in South Africa. Is that Berkeley? Is there a disconnect here? Can we learn something about this? Or even more dramatically, when we talk about civil political rights and the right to express yourself and legal capacity and personhood and ideas put forward by the International Disability Movement and the comment written by the general comment written by a CRPD committee. If you are in Kenya, and there are something like 300 Western-trained psychiatrists, and nearly all of them are in Nairobi, how do you access mental health? We're all supposed to have supported decision-making, paid for by the government. How do you access mental health or anything else? Well, the answer is you do it in culturally, contextually, resource-appropriate manners. Peer-to-peer support, relying on village elders, relying on traditional medicine, hopefully not relying on witch doctors who are dangerous. But it doesn't follow, it doesn't map out onto what is written in this treaty. And so this is some of the things that I and Paul and others have been thinking about. So how do you change it, right? How do you do a change, and where are the points that you can push to try to move forward? Well, one is the CRPD committee itself could work further to empower DPOs by reviewing in each one of their annual state reports whether the state has actually given over funding and or space and or other things to civil society to enable these groups to claim their rights and to move forward. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. It's vastly uneven. Could they write things like a comment or a protocol that is much more related to what's going on the ground? Yes. Much of it is written in very high aspirations, written as if it's coming down from Geneva or from New York, which is fine. And it's good to have these aspirations to create what Catherine Sicking would call a human rights cascade, or what Beth Simmons would refer to as a standard by which everyone can aspire to and move towards. But what do you do in the meantime? Data. Can the CRPD committee engage more strongly with the SDGs? Remember, we talked about the Millennium Development Goals that didn't include disability. Due to very strong advocacy, the Sustainable Development Goals, 2015 to 2030, and the 2030 Agenda, mentioned disability in 17 different places and included among the goals 6 times. Can the CRPD committee leverage? Because the SDGs is bringing money with it and bringing data with it. UNICEF is supposed to map out what exactly it means to be a child with a disability and to be in the education system under SDG 4. They're supposed to have a complete mapping by it was supposed to be 2020, and then it was 2022, and now it's going to be 2023, and I'd be very happy to see it. So can you leverage out the SDGs and the money that it brings? Can the committee do more of what it has been doing very well, which is interacting with other treaty bodies and trying to get intersectionality? You know, that word is very, very popular now in the UN system, as it is even in corporate governance. Remember, we had inclusion, we had sensitivity training when I graduated from law school, sensitivity training, which never mentioned disability. Then we had inclusion, and then we had corporate social responsibility, and then now we're on DEI, which also doesn't include the other D word. And I know this because I work with the groups. So can we get more intersectionality, right? Can we get more value and more leverage? This committee, over time, has actually done a good job in many ways. They had severe disagreements with the Committee on the Rights of the Child about whether children with disabilities and others should be living in foster homes or in other arrangements, and then met with them and ironed out a position between them. That was helpful. They had severe disagreements with the CEDAW Committee, Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, about abortion, about some of the things that the CRPD committee said, probably inartfully and wrongly, about women's rights to abortion, but then they ironed it out. Can they continue meeting with the Human Rights Committee, which revised its General Comment 35 on what it means to be involuntarily put into a facility and treated against one's will? They have pushed the HRC to move beyond where it was, not as far as they would like. Can they continue to do that? Can they continue to think about culturally appropriate ways, such as peer-to-peer counseling in terms of mental health? One of the more interesting things I've done recently, and which led to the mental health book with Vikram Patel and others, was to hear the Clubhouse International group, which exists in the US and in various places internationally, talk about what they do about peer-to-peer support. And what I really loved about it was they had never heard of the CRPD and never heard about human rights even. I mean, they were very American, and here they were. And what they described was absolutely on all 4 points with the CRPD and with enablement and with disability empowerment. Peer-to-peer, helping each other, not being exploited by professionals, not having epistemic communities taking control of things. So can we be more culturally and so creative? So that's what I have to say about the CRPD and the Global South for the moment. I think that there are many things that are extraordinarily promising out there. The World Bank adopting its environmental safeguards and others to include disability in its loans and gifts. The large bilateral donations from the states, including the European Union, being disability inclusive or at least moving towards it. USAID kind of limping along and not quite there, which PS, if you ask about the US and CRPD ratification, one of the ways that it would change if the US ratified the CRPD would be we'd actually have to obey our own laws, the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, and apply them extra territorially so that when we give out money, it's got to be disability inclusive and actually walk the walk that we say we do. So there's all kinds of promising things. We've seen the Security Council, and I had the honor of addressing them, consider and talk about armed conflict as far as disability. I had never mentioned that. I never included them as a vulnerable group or one that they should look at. We've seen the Sphere Group, the International Red Cross, and others talk about disability as a vulnerable population in terms of natural disasters. And by the way, I was in Mississippi and New Orleans the week after Katrina, and you could ask me about that. We could talk about that. We are seeing changes, but we're also seeing resistance and kind of areas where a lot of advocacy needs to be done. So the first article on crimes against humanity and disability by my two friends and I, the developing treaty on crimes against humanity does not include disability. Did we ever hear about the Nazis and T-40 and about bombing of hospitals and rehab centers and so on? But it's a moving target. The Developing Business and Human Rights Treaty, which references all the previous human rights treaties but does not include disability specifically. Think about what multinational corporations could do, not only if they included people with disabilities among their hiring needs, but also in their blockchains, what they do with suppliers, what they create. Right? Are their ATMs accessible? Are their ITCs accessible? What are they pushing out to the world? Will this actually take the world forward in an accessible way or continue to create inaccessible environments? So we have a lot of really interesting, wonderful things to look at, and I will stop and hand over to these lovely people to moderate.
Thank you so much, Professor Stein, for those insights and expertise. We'd like to turn it over to questions, if you'll indulge us. We have the possibility to ask questions both on Zoom and in person in the room. For those asking questions in the room, we have a microphone that will pass around. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and then please wait until you receive the microphone to ensure that everyone in this room, as well as on Zoom, can hear the questions that we're all asking. For those joining us on Zoom, you'll be able to ask questions within the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. So does anyone have any questions?
Very much appreciated your comments, Professor Stein, and now I'm amplified. I wanted to ask if there are still ongoing debates about the predicate question of what is a disability and how to define it, and whether in the convention, if you can recount any of the ways the predicate questions were resolved between countries and whether that cut north-south as well.
Wonderful question. The answer is there is no set definition in the CRPD. It exists in a social model description in the preamble and in Article 1, which is entitled Purpose. It does not exist in Article 2, which is Definitions. And it very much maps out similar to what we would think of in an ADA progressive kind of way. An impairment which in interaction with the built environment creates conditions that disable persons. We were down to the 8th session without a univocal definition of it, in large part because it's so culturally contextual. The disability rights movement on the one hand argues vehemently that disability is a social construct, but on the other hand, if it's a social construct, it's socially constructed. And so there was no univocal way of looking at it. It's in the purpose article for the acute reason that you cannot reserve against a treaty's purpose. And by putting this social model definition as opposed to a human rights model definition of disability into the purpose article, states cannot say, we're not going to take it. Having said that, there is the transposition and the leeway with which states can define what disability is. And if we were to graph out what things looked like in the year 2001, pretty much you would see that the more developed country, and therefore the less stigma attaching to disability, the higher the percentage of self-reported incidence or prevalence of disability. And so down here we would see under 1% from Kenya, Bangladesh, which is just biologically probably impossible, even with social constructs, roughly 6% in the Philippines, 6.7% now and forever in the People's Republic of China, and you can ask me on that, I'll be glad to tell you about it. US at 1.17, now closer to 19, New Zealand about 22, the UK about 22. So in places like the US, you'll hear a figure like, now that we're out of COVID, we realize that there's at least 1 in 5 people with a mental health issue. We don't hear that in where disability is even further stigmatized. There's been a big shift in that due to, if you want to get really geeky, I like geeky, due to the Washington City Group, which is based on the short 5 questions that are pulled from the US Census, going all the way back to 1932, and it's a functional definition based upon walking, seeing, bathing, taking care of yourself, etc. Once those are injected into national omnibus surveys, meaning the household surveys go on and on and on, we see different numbers. So South Africa went from roughly 4% to roughly 6.5%, but they don't ask about mental disability because they say it's impolite. Bangladesh, in the most recent numbers, is more up to 11%. The Philippines is more up to 11%. And another thing that's cultural that relates to it is how the questions are asked. So in pre-Civil War Yemen, the National Household Survey, translated from Arabic, was basically someone coming and knocking on your door and saying, do you, Allah forbid, or anyone else in your house, the Prophet, peace be upon him, have a disability? The answer is likely to be a no. Or in Bangladesh, where the census was taken by USAID right after the military government went to civilian government, and it was white, able-bodied males from the USAID mission going and knocking on doors and asking about disability, and they came back with something like a 6%. Then the DPOs, who are Bangladeshis speaking Bangla with disabilities, went and asked the question and came back with more like 14%. And the USAID mission head, no longer, to his credit, said, you know what, that makes sense because I grew up in Texas in the 50s, and if anyone came to my door and asked, are there any homosexuals in this house, they would have been shot. So it also depends upon who's asking the question and what the question is. But they're very much culturally constructed. And there should be a margin, right? I mean,
Could you say just a couple more words about what is the contrasting human rights model
human rights model
of disability? I mean, you said what's been embraced is this social model of disability, unlike the human rights model, and I just wasn't sure what's in that package.
social model, which has been very effectively put forward originally in the UK, transposed over to the US, very much maps out onto civil political rights. But for your prejudice, but for your preconceived notions, I, person with a disability, woman, Muslim, whatever, would be treated in the same way that every able-bodied white male, Christian, etc., has been taught. And it's a line in the sand. Thou shalt not discriminate, and that's it. We put a line, and that's it. Human rights model says, well, wait a minute, that's all fine and good, but what do you do about the gap in inequality? And what do you do about getting people of a level? Well, we have to invoke those economic, social, cultural rights that we don't invoke here in this country unless it's through Congress's beneficence and sort of stumbling into it. So a human rights model talks more about flourishing. It talks more about how to level the playing field and how to get people up to a level together. There's some boring work on that by Stein in various places if you're interested.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. I was really interested in your description of the diversity of views on many dimensions. And I'm wondering how you know when you're inclusive enough. So as you sit in a room and try to carve out these policies at a very high level, how do you know you're fully inclusive? And then that question becomes, I think, maybe more complex as you get down into the local level, where it feels like because of the diversity across geography, et cetera, you really have to be tapped into the heterogeneity within these different regions. And so how do you struggle with understanding when you are being fully inclusive as a body that's making decisions?
It's a marvelous question to which the answer in short form is we never are and we all fail, but it's a matter of committing to the process. We all, including myself, are never inclusive enough of all views or representing all views. And we all have to take concerted efforts to try to think about what those who are not in the room might be thinking and to honor their views. In the CRPD document, if you were to read it, you'll see that once the indigenous groups disappeared after the third session, any sort of activism for a separate indigenous article disappeared as well. The word indigenous appears only in the preamble once, but think about what difference you would make in terms of community values of property, because there's a property article, or the education article about being able to learn in your own modality, your own indigenous language, or about the article on culture, which is quite obvious. Elders are not mentioned ever in the article, in the treaty, which is partly because there were those of us who were over 40, but also partly because the NGOs never appeared and never assisted and never related. Now they're developing their own treaty, and the ambassador is UNITAR's head of thinking about that. And the lessons that are overlapping and intersectional are quite clear, right? Things like legal capacity, decision-making, supports, access to health, mobility, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. So it's thinking about those who are not present and trying to be sensitive to it, and we all fail that way. And within the disability rights community, my partner, Professor William Alford, and I have especially focused on those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, at least in part because we feel that their voices are often not heard. And so it's a wonderful and delightful irony that, you know, if people don't know me and I show up, they think I'm talking about ramps, which I can care less about. But I want to talk about easy read versions and accessible websites that people can understand. But it's a work in progress, and we all fail on it. And there's also the interesting, for being philosophical, tension between heuristics that group very diverse individuals together and sometimes work, but then also sometimes fail. So we're very comfortable in this country, even in our Supreme Court jurisprudence for many years, on pan-ethnicity. Right? Class actions of African Americans, and by the way, also Latinos, and by the way, also Asians, and then we hit Falcone and others. And we started to take it apart and think about what these groups are as far as being different from each other. With the disability group, we see it kind of in greater degree even as to particular forms of disability. And the challenge is to focus on what is that unites us as far as exclusion, and then to think really deeply about going down in the weeds and thinking about multiple axes and multiple locations that inform discriminatory inclusion and exclusion. And that's something that no one has solved, but hopefully if we become aware of it, we do it. And the short answer is, how do you do it? Well, to be ableist, and I'll say it's the eyeball test, which is not fair to my friends who don't see that way. And that is, if you're in a room nowadays and it's all white males, you kind of scratch your head and say, right? Do we do that now with disability or with other groups? And something we all can work on and support each other on.
So this is a question closely related to the previous question. I'm wondering, and you certainly said things about this in the talk, but I'm wondering if you can make any sort of generalization about what difference it makes to do this kind of high-level UN work, given the profound heterogeneity of experience on the ground. So you're talking, when you're talking about independent living, and how different that looks from one country to another, from one locality to another. What is the difference that it makes for the UN and its organizations and for all of the contributing organizations to do this work? Can you see differences specifically attributable to that work, and can you generalize the ways in which you are able to be effective, make some change in the world, maybe some parts of the world but not others, the ways you can and the degrees to which you can, and sort of the degrees to which things are just out of reach of that sort of process?
Okay, that's great. It's a huge question, and it's a great huge question. By setting standards, even if they are the gold standard, and even if they are those that will not be reached anytime soon, if at all, I agree with Simmons and others that you set things for which civil society and societies can aspire towards. Having said that, you always need to be very sensitive to culture and to how it plays out. So it's good to have the ultimate standard. It's good to have the ultimate thing of which we ought to be moving towards, which is one of the things that really troubled me when the U.S. National Council on Disability, I did their study on how U.S. federal law and the CRPD compares, and then they changed things without asking or telling. And one of the things they put in that was absolutely wrong was that you should be careful of the CRPD because it could have you go to lower standards of protection. And there isn't a world under this sky in which that's the case. So we set standards and we try to get to them, but we're also cynical about them, right? I mean, I'm the lawyer who teaches future and present lawyers. to write the best standards that you can, because then you set the goals. But to understand that closing the gap between that and reality is time and effort and heads banged against the walls and lots of tears. Sometimes happy tears, but usually frustrating tears, because that's the best that we can do. We have seen dramatic changes, right? If we were just going to take the idea of mental health, we would see that, there's 35 countries that have thrown out and are revising their mental health laws. And many of them are in East Anglophone Africa and are the relics, the British are always responsible, the relics of the Victorian lunacy acts, right, and colonialism, which is incredibly ironic because you have these governments now that are anti-colonial, and rightly so, having thrown off the imperialists and are enforcing the imperialist mental health laws. But we're seeing 35 at the moment being redone. We're seeing national laws being redone all over the world or written all over the world. We're seeing constitutions starting to include disability. If you were to go, for example, to World Policy Analysis Center at UCLA and look up, and they have various sectors there, but look up under disability and look up the analyses done by Jody Hyman and her colleagues, you would see that most of the new constitutions that are being done from the time of the CRPD onwards now include disability as a protected category. Is it enough if society doesn't believe that this should be implemented? No. But it's a standard that you try to move towards. The flip side is that there are many places where there are beautiful laws. Right? South Africa, disability is included in their constitution. The white paper from 1997 is about inclusive education. PEPUTA, which is their employment law, carries disability. The Philippines has a Magna Carta for disability rights. And the question is, how much are these actually being implemented? Unlike, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act and its employment provisions, which in 30 years plus, and then, by the way, go ahead another 30 years in advance of it, has not moved the needle 1 percentage point on disability-related employment policy. Oops, sorry. It's all in the implementation at the end, but you can only get to implementation if you get the standard first.
We also have a few questions coming in on Zoom, so I want to make sure we get to a couple of those. One of the participants asked, it is commonplace to hear distinctions drawn between physical and mental disabilities. The participant notes, that has never made sense to me since the brain is an organ. Do you see cross-country differences in how those notions are integrated or distinguished?
Oh, there are many, many places that will have a laundry list of what disabilities count as disabilities, much like our ADA, HHS, CFR list of what counts as disabilities. And they will even accord different numbers and weights to various things, such as how many fingers, limbs, etc., not unlike our post-Civil War Union soldiers' pensions fund. There are lots of places that will not include autism as a recognized form of disability. There are lots of places that will not recognize psychosocial disability, otherwise known as mental illness or mental disabilities, mental health issues, as disabilities. It varies from place to place to place. And it's hugely varied and hugely cultural. But no, I don't see, to me, getting bogged down into the definition of disability, which is what we've done in 30 plus years of the ADA, is not where we need to be going. Where we need to be going is looking at stigma and subordination based on ableism or disabling ideas and trying to eradicate that. And by the way, if the person in an absolute, empirically, magical, perfect way does not happen to have a disability, but we've eliminated subordination based on disability, why is that a bad thing?
We have another question in the Zoom chat. As the UN treaty bodies increasingly include disability in their standard work, do you see the role of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability changing in the future?
They have the ability to flex their muscles in ways that they have not yet. They have been very clever in reaching out to other committees. Traditionally, in the UN system, there is an annual meeting of the chairs of the various treaty bodies, which is helpful in sort of airing some laundry and connecting. But this committee, beginning with Ron McCallum, has made the efforts, and he's no longer on the committee, has made the efforts to reach out to other committees to try to get intersectionality and to try to get better coverage. This committee has powers it has not yet used. It has used its inquiry powers to look at the United Kingdom and the cuts in social welfare benefits. It has not used its powers to look at Afghani or Ukrainian refugees with disabilities, or large-scale institutions in post-Soviet countries. It hasn't done that. Its original powers would have been much larger, but at the end of the negotiations, they come down much closer to what is there. They can reference the Sustainable Development Goals a lot better. They can reference other UN human rights treaties much better, and so can all the other treaties. If you want to see an empirical analysis of that, Shesti Skarsgård and I looked at all the non-CRPD treaties and asked what they did post-CRPD, how much they referenced disability or not, and the answer is quick uptick, and then plateau, and then moving into platitudes of canned language relating to vulnerable populations. So there's a large way that all the treaty bodies can support each other and don't do so enough yet.
All right, we have another question from the Zoom. Can you explain in more detail why the U.S. has not signed on to the CRPD?
Ooh, how much trouble can I get into? I'm not sure how much trouble I can get into. If we take the argument as stated and assume it is principled, that the U.S. believes it is exceptional, and therefore is the only country of 193 UN member states that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is the only country, in addition to Iran, that has not ratified the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. See, US and Iran can agree in its suppression of women and so forth. If we take it on its face value that the US feels it is exceptional, you have to wonder about the vote in the Senate, which garnered 61 out of 66 towards the end of the Obama administration. U.S. has always been very verbal about being the world leader in disability, and in some ways it is. The IDEA, which is flawed and uneven and does all kinds of messy stuff, is marvelous compared to most of the rest of the world. The expectation that kids with disabilities go to school with other kids, period, is incredible, and it's beyond even the thought processes of many other states out there. But the U.S. decided not to, and to me, it was a combination of the beginning of these, I don't know what you want to call it, cuckoo politics, with Senator Sanitation and the Cato Institute and others saying all kinds of untruths, such as the UN's going to come and see whether you're beating your child and whether you're keeping a locked gun in your cabinet. I mean, what on earth does that have to do with the CRPD? It is very telling that 38 Republicans either abstained or did not vote at that point in time, if this is a across-the-aisle issue, including Orrin Hatch, who was one of the sponsors of the ADA. It tells you that it was, to me, the beginning of the politics of fear that we're now seeing, in extremis. Also, there's also the disability community, which we have to blame. And I'll get into trouble, but I think this is right. Those of us who were at the UN as part of the negotiations, consulted with state, consulted with White House. Some of us were in the Oval Office with my classmate's husband when he said, I'm not going to support the CRPD because everything for me now is the ACA, and that's the best thing I could do for domestic disability is to sever either you work or you have health care. And that's the best thing I could do for you, and that's where I'm putting my political eggs. And he was very overt about it. But he also appointed the USICD, U.S. International Council on Disability, to run point on the ratification politics, they ran 0 town hall meetings. There was no town hall meetings in, say, Iowa, where you had disabled veterans and Special Olympics athletes looking at their senators and saying, this is important to us. That didn't exist. There was no outreach to Republican senators until, the morning of the vote. And that has to take that has to take some credit too. Having said that, 61 out of 66 is a lot closer than the Women's Treaty or the Children's Treaty got. So you could look at it various ways. I don't like it.
All right, we're coming up on our time, and I want to be mindful. I think we'll take one more quick question, maybe not quick, but if you could address how learning differences as well as learning disabilities are included in the conversation at the UN as well.
It's part of the disability tent. It's part of the disability tent. It's part of the vision in UNICEF relating to children with disabilities. It's part of the SDGs. But also, we also have to be careful about linguistics. In the UK, if you said learning difficulties, you'd be including the group of people with IDD. And in the US, you would not. You'd be speaking about dysgraphia, dyslexia, and so forth. But any physical, mental, sensory, or other disability that in relation with the environment impedes access to, et cetera, is a covered disability, at least as far as UN work.
Great. Well, if everyone could join me in thanking our speaker today. Thank you so much.